you need to choose your friends wisely. And Sweden is choosing Canada, and I think rightly so. And we're also seeing a very strategic work from Canada, and not least from Prime Minister Carney himself, in choosing his friends globally now very, very strategically. And I think Sweden is a great partner to Canada.
Canada just experienced one of the most remarkable diplomatic moments of the year, one that cuts directly to the heart of the Canada-US relationship and reveals how the world is quietly shifting its alliances in 2025. Standing in a Canadian TV studio, Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister Ebba Busch delivered a message so clear, so blunt, and so politically symbolic that it immediately reverberated through Western capitals. You need to choose your friends wisely, she said, and Sweden is choosing Canada. At a time when the United States is pressuring Ottawa over the F-35 contract and warning that NORAD cooperation could be reconsidered, Sweden arrived on Canadian soil and publicly picked Carney's Canada over Trump's America. It wasn't a polite diplomatic gesture, it was a strategic declaration.
The exchange happened during Busch's exclusive interview on Canadian television. She was in the country with an unusually high-level delegation: Sweden's king and queen, top cabinet ministers, and senior executives from major Swedish firms, including Saab. Their visit centered on deepening economic and security cooperation, and more specifically, presenting Saab's Gripen fighter jet as a serious alternative to the U.S. F-35s Canada has ordered. Under the original plan, Canada committed to purchasing 88 F-35s from the United States, but ongoing delays and swelling costs have left a significant capability gap. Only the first 16 jets are unscheduled to arrive. That leaves more than 70 aircraft unfilled, which suddenly makes Sweden's timing very strategic. Busch made it clear that Sweden can produce those jets, deliver them, and even build substantial portions of the production line inside Canada. What made this interview remarkable wasn't just Sweden pitching a fighter jet, it was Sweden openly acknowledging the political pressure the United States is exerting on Canada, and contrasting that behavior with their own. When asked about U.S. warnings that NORAD could be affected if Canada considers a non-American jet, Busch responded with a directness rarely heard in diplomacy. If you cave under pressure from a so-called friend, she said, that weakness will be exploited. The message was unmistakable. Sweden was telling Canada, we don't threaten our allies, we don't weaponize security partnerships, and we don't make you choose between sovereignty and cooperation.
To understand the weight of Busch's words, you have to look at the global context. The world in 2025 is increasingly unstable, with Putin's war continuing in Europe, China limiting its rare earth exports, and Donald Trump's second term redefining Washington's approach to alliances. The U.S. now ties trade, security, and diplomacy together in ways that create uncertainty for partners. Sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, threats to Canada's auto industry, and warnings over defense cooperation have all become part of a larger pressure campaign. That shift is pushing many countries, especially in Europe, to reconsider who they trust. Sweden's deputy PM didn't hide that reality. She said the United States has become much more unpredictable, and that Sweden is actively seeking partners who uphold shared values without using leverage or intimidation. In her view, Canada is one of the few countries that meets that standard, a stable, dependable middle power with a consistent commitment to democratic principles and multilateral cooperation. What's striking is that this isn't an isolated opinion. Reuters, Bloomberg, and Global News all report increasing European unease with Trump's foreign policy. Countries like Sweden, Finland, and even Germany have been quietly expanding defense ties with Canada, particularly after Ottawa helped accelerate Sweden's entry into NATO. There's a sense that Canada, under Mark Carney's leadership, offers a level of stability and reliability that Washington can no longer consistently guarantee. Carney's global strategy has amplified Canada's international voice. In the past few months, Canada has signed a security partnership with South Korea, advanced trade talks with ASEAN, and doubled down on its critical minerals strategy with Japan, Germany, and now Sweden. Canada is actively rebuilding the industrial alliances that protect its economic sovereignty, and Sweden's announcement fits perfectly into that narrative.
The Gripen E isn't just another fighter jet on the market.
It represents a completely different model of partnership, one where Canada gains industrial capacity, not just aircraft. Saab has already told CBC and the Globe and Mail that it is prepared to shift substantial production to Canadian soil. That means Canadian aerospace workers get the jobs, not American factories. It also means that maintenance, technology transfer, and long-term economic benefits stay inside Canada instead of flowing south of the border. For Washington, that is a direct challenge. The U.S. uses arms exports, especially the F-35 program, as a tool of geopolitical influence. When allies buy American jets, they also buy decades of maintenance contracts, supply chain dependency, and strategic alignment. If Canada takes a different path, it sends a message that the United States is no longer the only option for advanced military systems. That is why the U.S. ambassador's warning about NORAD hit such a nerve. It sounded less like cooperation and more like coercion. Sweden's counter-message could not have been more different. Busch essentially told Canada a real ally doesn't need to threaten you. A real ally earns your partnership.
It's no accident that Sweden's diplomatic tone is so warm toward Canada right now. Since taking office, Mark Carney has pushed a foreign policy defined by diversification, independence, and long-term strategic planning. His government is actively reducing Canada's reliance on U.S. supply chains, especially in defense, energy, and critical minerals. Carney is presenting Canada as a global partner that is principled but not naive, open to cooperation but unwilling to be pressured. Sweden clearly sees this. Busch praised Carney's global strategy in the interview, saying Canada is choosing its friends very strategically, and that Sweden wants to deepen that alignment. It's a diplomatic compliment, but also a recognition that Canada is emerging as a central player in the Western realignment.
Sweden didn't just bring a proposal to Canada, it brought a public declaration of trust, one that directly contrasts with the behavior Canada has been facing from its closest neighbor. In a world where alliances are shifting and great powers are acting unpredictably, Sweden chose to say out loud what many U.S. partners have been whispering. Canada is becoming the reliable anchor in a turbulent era. The real question now is how Ottawa responds. Canada can accept a partnership based on respect and mutual benefit, or it can continue navigating a relationship where cooperation is tied to threats. Sweden just placed its bet, and it chose Canada.
We begin on that profanity-filled rant by U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra. Hoekstra was at a high-profile event in Ottawa Monday meant to celebrate the Canada-U.S. relationship.
A witness says that he could be heard swearing, using the F word, and mentioning Doug Ford, his name, and that it appears that Pete Hoekstra was upset about this Ontario ad.
It began with a shocking outburst in the middle of Ottawa's most formal diplomatic evening. At a high-profile Canada-U.S. gala, U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra turned the room silent when he began swearing at Ontario's trade representative, David Patterson. Witnesses said the ambassador used profanity, even mentioning Doug Ford by name in front of diplomats and business leaders. The event was supposed to be a symbol of friendship. Every year, both countries raise their glasses for a joint friendship toast. But this time, only the Canadian side spoke. The American ambassador stayed seated. What should have been a quiet moment of goodwill turned into a public embarrassment and a sign of just how deep the rift between Washington and Ottawa has grown. The question now isn't just about one man losing his temper. It's about what that anger reveals, a frustration that runs straight from the Trump White House to America's closest ally. Ambassador Hoekstra's anger didn't come out of nowhere. He was triggered by an Ontario government ad that aired across U.S. television screens. The ad used the voice of former Republican President Ronald Reagan, warning about the dangers of high tariffs, the same ad that infuriated Donald Trump days earlier. Trump declared that all trade talks with Canada were terminated and threatened a new 10% tariff on Canadian goods. Within hours, the mood in Washington turned from tense to explosive. Hoekstra, a Trump loyalist, seemed to take that anger personally.
But underneath the surface, the outrage had little to do with advertising. It was about control. For months, Washington has tried to pressure Canada to yield in ongoing trade discussions. Instead, Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, stood firm. They used calm diplomacy and sharp strategy rather than panic. The Ontario ad became more than just a TV spot. It became a quiet statement that Canada would no longer play by Washington's intimidation rules. And that, perhaps, is what truly set the ambassador off. When diplomats start shouting, it's usually because their arguments are failing.
Doug Ford's response was measured, confident, and unmistakably Canadian. Pacing reporters, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult back. He simply called on the ambassador to apologize and move forward. He reminded everyone that Ontario's trade representative had done nothing wrong. He was defending his province in the face of constant attacks. Ford even used humor to lower the temperature, saying the cheese slipped off the cracker. But behind the humor was a powerful message. Ontario would not be bullied, not by tariffs and not by temper. Ford framed the moment as a defense of both his province and his country. He reminded Americans that Canada was being targeted, its auto industry, its steel sector, its manufacturing base. And he made clear that rolling over was not an option. When you attack our province, you attack our country, he said earlier this week. For ordinary Canadians, the scene felt familiar, frustration mixed with resilience. In Ford's tone, there was no hostility toward Americans themselves. He said, "We love Americans," separating people from politics. But he made no secret of how he viewed Trump's behavior. It was blunt, emotional, and deeply human, a reflection of how many Canadians now feel about their once trusted ally.
While Ford was speaking publicly, Prime Minister Mark Carney remained silent, strategically silent. He was in South Korea at the time, attending the same summit as President Trump. The two leaders sat at the same dinner table, but didn't speak. Trump later posted online, "We didn't come to South Korea to see Canada." That silence, though, spoke volumes. Carney didn't need to trade insults. His policies have already begun reshaping Canada's trade position. Over the past months, Ottawa has finalized or expanded major economic agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Canada is also deepening its investment links with ASEAN nations, a diversification strategy designed to reduce reliance on the U.S. market. In other words, while Washington has chosen confrontation, Ottawa is quietly building alternatives. Canadian exports to Asia and Europe are rising. New investments are flowing into critical minerals, nuclear technology, and advanced manufacturing.
Former officials from both sides of the border have described the current climate as the lowest point in decades. John Manley, Canada's former Deputy Prime Minister, said the relationship has shifted from partnership to performance, more theater than diplomacy. Gordon Giffen, a former U.S. ambassador under Bill Clinton, said ambassadors are supposed to deliver difficult messages, not profanity. He admitted that the outburst showed poor judgment and warned that the U.S. approach was undermining progress. Both men agreed that trust, once the backbone of the Canada-U.S. relationship, has been eroding fast. Canada's confidence in American reliability has been shaken. The United States, once seen as a predictable ally, now acts like a volatile negotiator. This breakdown is more than symbolic. Trade between the two countries accounts for nearly $800 billion a year, according to 2024 data from Statistics Canada and the U.S. Department of Commerce. But the tone from Washington is making long-term cooperation harder to sustain. What used to be a partnership of equals now feels like a power struggle.
The results of Trump's trade offensive are now clear. Automakers like Stellantis and GM have pulled investment from Ontario, yet rising costs and inflation inside the U.S. are straining supply chains and angering American workers. Rather than isolating Canada, Washington has isolated itself. European and Asian partners are strengthening ties with Ottawa, while the U.S. loses diplomatic goodwill even among its closest allies. Canada's leadership, meanwhile, has found a confident, steady voice. The Reagan ad, once a simple reminder of economic common sense, has turned into a symbol of how far U.S. trade policy has drifted from its own principles. Every insult from Washington only reinforces Canada's resolve to move independently. What Trump hoped would divide Canada has instead united it, around leaders determined to defend their economy and their dignity.
Back in Ottawa, the empty chair at the gala's toasts said more than any speech could. The United States, once Canada's closest friend, couldn't even share a glass of champagne. Carney's government continues its quiet path, expanding global partnerships, supporting industry, and rebuilding confidence. Ford stands publicly defending his province, demanding dignity and respect. Together, they reflect a new phase of Canadian identity. Steady under pressure, firm in principle. Meanwhile, Washington's outbursts keep making headlines. When ambassadors swear and presidents post insults, it doesn't show power, it shows frustration. In the end, Trump's tariffs didn't break Canada. They revealed its resilience. The louder Washington shouts, the calmer Ottawa seems. And in that silence, in the moment when only one side raised a glass, the world saw what real strength looks like.
U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war has prompted a frantic search for new markets for Canadian trade.
I think that Canada would be very wise to start negotiating what China is putting on the table now. We keep talking about the fact that we've got to have new trading routes, new trading partners, after what's happened with the Americans.
It began quietly, with a series of small but deliberate steps. While Washington doubled down on new tariffs and threats against Canada's auto sector, Beijing did something few expected. It extended an open hand. China offered to ease restrictions on Canadian agriculture, to welcome energy and minerals, and even to discuss joint opportunities in the fast-growing electric vehicle market. For decades, Canada's trade story revolved around its southern neighbor. Nearly 3/4 of its exports still travel across the border to the United States. But when President Donald Trump renewed his campaign of pressure, raising duties on metals, furniture, and now vehicles, Ottawa began to realize that relying on one market had become a vulnerability. In that moment, Canada didn't retaliate loudly. It changed direction. Trump's hardline strategy, meant to force Canada into submission, is now pushing it toward a new path, one that leads east toward China. The spark came from the auto industry. In early October, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told a Toronto audience that when it comes to vehicle production, it is America first, Canada second. His words carried the weight of Trump's new tariff threat, a 25% tax on cars and parts entering the U.S. from Canada. For Ontario, this was not just rhetoric, it was an existential problem. About 500,000 jobs in southern Ontario depend on the auto supply chain, which is deeply integrated with factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Each vehicle assembled in Canada includes roughly 50% U.S.-made parts. Any disruption in that chain hurts both sides of the border. By the time Lutnick's comments made headlines, investors were already nervous. Ottawa's Trade Department estimated that a prolonged 25% tariff could cut Canada's annual auto exports by tens of billions of dollars and trigger layoffs across steel, aluminum, and manufacturing. Even in the U.S., analysts warned that the policy would raise production costs for American automakers. Yet, Trump showed no sign of backing down. His message was clear: production should move south no matter the cost. And that was the moment Canada began looking elsewhere for stability.
And what did we get in return from the Americans for putting ourselves in lockstep with them, for backing them up on their 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles? We got slapped with our own tariffs. That's how Donald Trump plays the game.
I have said multiple times, if Canada is ready to correct these practices, China will also respond accordingly.
While Washington was building barriers, Beijing was sending signals. Chinese officials opened discussions about renewed agricultural imports and potential cooperation in clean tech manufacturing. For Canada, still facing China's tariffs on canola imposed in previous years, it was a sign of thawing relations. According to trade analysts interviewed by CTV News, China's proposal was straightforward. Canada could reopen its market to Chinese electric vehicles, most priced between $35,000 and $40,000 Canadian dollars, and in return, Beijing would ease restrictions on Canadian farm exports. The idea was practical. Canadian consumers would gain access to affordable EVs, while farmers would regain access to a market of 1.4 billion people. The timing was no coincidence. Trump's 100% tariff on Chinese electric cars had effectively locked China out of the American market. Beijing was searching for a G7 partner willing to engage, and Canada's strained ties with Washington created that opportunity. Inside Ottawa, officials saw both risk and leverage. Canada could diversify trade while reminding the United States that loyalty cannot be one-sided. China was not replacing the U.S., but it was offering something Trump had taken away, a choice.
By mid-October, Canada's shift was visible in both policy and tone. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government increased funding for domestic manufacturing, steel, and energy. The Federal Finance Ministry confirmed new support programs to offset losses from U.S. tariffs, while Ontario Premier Doug Ford publicly called for stronger protection of auto workers. At the same time, Ottawa kept its diplomatic language measured. It lifted certain retaliatory tariffs to encourage dialogue with Washington, but it held firm on a 25% levy for U.S. vehicles entering Canada. That single policy sent a clear message: Canada was willing to talk, but not to yield. Officials close to the trade file described the strategy as sectoral resilience. Instead of chasing one massive free trade agreement, Canada pursued smaller, industry-specific arrangements on steel, aluminum, agriculture, and potentially electric vehicles, with partners beyond the U.S. border. Beijing's outreach fit naturally into that framework. Canada's auto suppliers and EV battery producers were already exploring Asia for investment, while Chinese companies sought access to critical minerals like nickel and lithium from northern Ontario. For both sides, cooperation looked less like defiance and more like common sense. As one senior Canadian diplomat put it in a televised interview, the goal is no longer to depend on any single partner, but to build a network of equals. Trump's threats only accelerated that mindset. For the United States, the ripple effects are becoming clear. Trump's tariffs were designed to rebuild U.S. industry, but they are instead inflating costs and alienating allies. Data from the U.S. Department of Commerce show that steel and aluminum prices have climbed nearly 20% since early 2025. Vehicle prices are rising, and manufacturers are warning of lower profits. In the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, factories that depend on cross-border trade are struggling with shortages of Canadian parts. Economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago recently reported that every 10% increase in tariff costs reduces Midwest manufacturing output by roughly 2%. Meanwhile, Canada's exploration of Chinese markets signals something Washington has long feared: that America's closest trading partner can function without it. Instead of isolating China, the White House has driven a wedge into North America's economic core. The more Trump insists on control, the less control he actually has. Canada's pivot toward China is not an act of rebellion. It is a lesson in adaptation. Faced with tariffs on steel, aluminum, softwood, and now vehicles, Ottawa did not surrender or retaliate blindly. It moved with quiet precision, securing new options for its economy and protecting its workers. The results are beginning to surface. Exports to Asian markets are slowly expanding. Talks with China are ongoing. And within Canada, the idea of depending solely on the United States is losing its appeal. Trump's campaign to dominate trade has exposed a deeper truth: influence cannot be enforced by threats. While Washington measures power in tariffs, Canada is learning to measure it in choices.
If Ottawa and Beijing continue to align, America could lose more than contracts and factories. It could lose the trust that once defined its leadership. The tariff war Trump started was meant to make America strong again. But the calm, calculated response from Canada may be what truly reshapes the future of North American trade.
Almost all of the current cobalt supply comes from China.
Cobalt is considered a key material in the race to build the batteries that power electric vehicles.
As major financial strides are being taken to open North America's first cobalt refinery plant in North Cobalt.
This is going to be the very first critical minerals project to reach production of any sort of significance in Canada in many, many years.
While headlines focus on tariffs and trade disputes, another shift is quietly reshaping the future of North America. The United States, a country that prides itself on industrial dominance, may soon depend on Canada for one of the most important materials of the clean energy age. That material is cobalt. It is essential for electric vehicle batteries, defense technology, and advanced electronics. And almost all of it today comes from refining operations in China. This is why the announcement from Ontario matters. The province has pledged 17.5 million Canadian dollars toward the first large-scale cobalt refinery in North America. At first glance, it looks like a regional investment. In reality, it signals a strategic turn that could place Canada at the center of North America's energy transition.
The project is led by Electra Battery Materials in Temiskaming Shores, a community in northern Ontario. Once completed, it will produce about 6,500 tons of battery-grade cobalt sulfate each year. That is enough to supply materials for roughly 1 million electric vehicles annually. It will also create around 50 direct jobs in the area, with more indirect work tied to logistics and construction. The cost of building the refinery is estimated at 100 million Canadian dollars. Ontario's contribution is part of a broader financing mix. The United States Department of Defense has already provided $20 million, showing Washington's concern about reliable supply. Electra itself is restructuring to cut debt by 60% and raise $30 million in new equity. Talks with Canada's federal government are underway for an additional 20 million Canadian dollars. These are not small gestures. They are building blocks for the first critical minerals project of real scale to reach production in Canada in many years.
The economic upside is clear. At current market levels, annual revenues from 6,500 tons of cobalt sulfate could range between 160 and 230 million US. Analysts following Electra's restructuring estimate the refinery could generate around $30 million in earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation once it is running steadily. Beyond numbers, the strategic benefits are significant. Canada moves from being a supplier of raw ore to holding a high-value position in the EV supply chain. This strengthens its credibility as a secure and transparent supplier without ties to foreign state-linked entities. For policymakers, it reinforces the logic of Bill C-5, known as the One Canadian Economy legislation, which is designed to speed up approvals for mining and energy projects. The refinery shows that Canada can actually deliver. It is a demonstration project, but one with continental reach. Canada also gains something less tangible but equally important: negotiating leverage. In past trade disputes, Ottawa has often been the side under pressure, whether on dairy quotas or lumber tariffs. With cobalt, the balance shifts. Possessing the only refinery of its kind in North America allows Canada to speak not just as a junior partner, but as a gatekeeper of critical technology inputs. This leverage could shape future talks on auto rules of origin, EV mandates, and even defense procurement, where secure mineral supply is now considered a matter of national security.
The United States faces a basic problem. It has growing demand for cobalt in electric vehicles and defense systems, yet it has no large domestic refining capacity. China continues to dominate the market, and Washington has made clear it wants alternatives. By 2027, when Electra expects to begin production, American automakers and defense contractors are likely to look north to secure supply. Canada cannot cover all of U.S. demand, but this refinery can provide a reliable North American source that reduces exposure to Beijing. That creates a new dynamic. For once, Canada holds a card that Washington needs. Tariffs and trade disputes may strain the relationship, but Cobalt has the power to reset it. The energy transition in the United States will not be built only on Detroit assembly lines. It will also depend on a refinery in northern Ontario, funded in part by a provincial pledge that may change the balance of supply chains across the continent.